I call the Honourable Minister Stephen Joyce.
Mr. Speaker, where does one begin after that? Because I've never heard such an empty pile of baseless rhetoric in a long time. In fact, since I last heard my last David Cunliffe speech, Mr. Speaker, where do we start with Mr. Robertson? Mr. Robertson, who tries to lecture a national government about the budget, when he opposed every single expenditure-saving initiative that this government has done over the last 6 years, and in areas that I have some interest in, for example, in tertiary education, the only new policy they have announced is to reduce or stop the reductions in adult and community education that we made back in 2010, Mr. Speaker. The news in tertiary education, if Labor was re-elected, they'd reinstate Moroccan cooking subsidies, Mr. Speaker. That's the extent, as Bill English was talking about, of the deep thinking that hasn't been occurring in the New Zealand Labor Party, Mr. Speaker. Empty, baseless rhetoric. And actually quite sad, Mr. Speaker. The other one is ACC, declaring somehow that the national government has given insufficient cost cuts to people from ACC. It was the Labor Party that made the ACC's costs blow out. And now he's lecturing the national government about how to behave responsibly with ACC. And that, I'm afraid, Mr. Speaker, is one of the reasons why they're struggling to connect with New Zealanders, Mr. Speaker, because New Zealanders know the record. They know what the Labor Party were like. They haven't forgotten. And Mr. Robertson can stand up and pretend that things were not the way they were, but actually New Zealanders have a longer memory than that, Mr. Speaker. And, Mr. Speaker, the good news is actually that all these views that the Labor Party has of New Zealand and New Zealanders is wrong. All of them are wrong. All of them are massive exaggerations and, in fact, delusions about how New Zealand actually is. Is there an export crisis? No, Mr. Speaker. Is there a regional crisis? No. Is there a current account crisis? No. Is there a manufacturing crisis? No. Is there an immigration crisis? No, there isn't, Mr. Speaker. And if this is a housing crisis, explain to me how you can have a lift in construction of housing of 17% in 1 quarter in New Zealand, an increase of 17% to the biggest level of activity since 2002, and I sense that crisis is receding as well, Mr. Speaker. What is actually happening is none of those things. It's a crisis. There are insufficient crises for the Labor Party to be able to convince and bamboozle New Zealanders that actually somehow they should be given another shot, Mr. Speaker. Actually, the true story is that the New Zealand economy is going very well, Mr. Speaker. One of the fastest growing in the OECD. Balance of payments was asked about earlier in this House this afternoon, down to 2.8% of GDP, the lowest figure by a long way in a long time. We inherited, by the way, nearly 8%. What we owe the world has dropped, Mr. Speaker, down a good 20% of the economy. Isn't that amazing? This country owes the world 20% of its economy less than when National first came into office. That is actually a very impressive figure, which is a tribute to the hard work of New Zealanders, Mr. Speaker. Our goods exports have just passed 50 billion New Zealand dollars in 1 year for the first time. And not only is that a good thing, Mr. Speaker, but it's also at the highest New Zealand dollar rate that we have just about ever seen, which means that the amount of goods going offshore is even greater than that number suggests, Mr. Speaker. And we've seen another interesting statistic, Mr. Speaker, and that is the drop of outward migration to Australia. And that rightly worried New Zealanders for a long time, Mr. Speaker. When we came in 2008, 35,000 New Zealanders in that year, net terms, a net 35,000 New Zealanders moved off to Australia, Mr. Speaker. And then it dropped a bit, and then it went up a bit after the Christchurch earthquakes. And now, Mr. Speaker, last month, just 200 New Zealanders moved across to Australia in net terms. And the month before, just 200, Mr. Speaker. So now it's 400 over 2 months. That's an annual rate of 2,000 or 3,000 a year, Mr. Speaker. New Zealanders are voting with their feet, all right. They're voting with their feet to stay in this country and experience the job opportunities in this country. But I want to touch on regional New Zealand, Mr. Speaker. because Mr Robertson, I think, has made at least one trip now to the regions since he's been the spokesperson for regional development of the Labor Party. That's very exciting for him, I'm sure. He got very excited, went to Rotorua, I understand, and met Tamati Coffee, apparently, who's apparently a normal Rotoruian. I suspect, I'm not sure about that. But anyway, regional economies, Mr Speaker. Let's talk about that, because actually the regional economies have led New Zealand out of the GFC. And we have got a range of policies in our business growth agenda, which Mr Robertson would do well to read, 120-odd pages. It'll keep him up for about a month. 120 pages, Mr Speaker. But here's what's not in it. There is no reference to a carbon price at 5 times the world price, Mr Speaker, in National's economic policy. There is no reference to high water levies like Mr Parker wants in National's economic policy. There is no reference to banning oil exploration in the Taranaki Bight, Mr Speaker, which both the Labor Party and the Green Party have declared what they want. There is no reference to a capital gains tax that would hit 100% of New Zealand businesses, but whoops, only hit 25% of New Zealand houses, Mr Speaker. And there is no mention of a wacky monetary policy which would have the whole world confused, Mr Speaker. Those are not in National's economic policies, and regions around the country will breathe a sigh of relief about that, Mr Speaker, because 13 of our 16 regions are dependent on the natural resources economy, Mr Speaker. 13 of our 16. And the Greens can pretend that's not the case, but it is. And this government understands that. We understand you have to balance the jobs of regional New Zealanders against the environmental constraints. And actually, if you do it well, you can get improvements in both outcomes, but not if you treat the whole thing like a cartoon and look to ban oil prospecting, look to knock the dairy industry over, as is proposed by the Greens and even Labor, Mr Speaker. And that's what we're dealing with. Oh, the other thing, what's really important to regional New Zealand is trade deals, Mr Speaker. They are very important. Access to other people's goods markets is crucial to regional New Zealand. And if you look around this House, the weirdest thing about that at the moment, Mr Speaker, is there is only one major party in this House that is unambiguously in favour of doing more trade deals for New Zealand exporters, and that is the National Party. The Labor Party don't know what they think, and the Green Party, as always, are opposed, Mr Speaker, and that's the reality of it. That's what's dealing with. Mr Goff, you're sadly in a party which has moved to the left around you, Mr Goff. That's the reality of the situation. The unambiguous support for trade deals in the Labor Party is gone. Mr Goff has been rolled by his mates, and Shane Jones knew it, and that's why Shane Jones left, Mr Speaker, because he knew all these things that I have just laid out. And that's why regional New Zealand ain't going anywhere near the Labor Party, Mr Speaker, because the Greens can talk about promoting exports by buying everybody a 3D printer. Apparently that's the gig. A 3D printer is what you need to succeed in the green world. They must be printing 3D money, Mr Speaker. But all these other things get the knock. All these other industries. And New Zealanders know, Mr Speaker, it's not real. And New Zealanders know that actually you can't do these things, and New Zealanders know you can't have the attitude of the opposition, which is to push a whole lot of imposts on New Zealand businesses and expect them to keep growing jobs for Kiwis. That, Mr Speaker, is what we have done and are doing. 84,000 jobs in the last year, Sue Moroney. Think about that for a minute, and that's because this government is supporting the growth of businesses with policies that enhance their competitiveness on the world stage, not reduce their competitiveness on the world stage, Mr Speaker. And our job now, Mr Speaker, now that the economy is growing well, is to ensure we remove those capacity constraints, and that's what we're doing. That we're encouraging the skills growth in the New Zealand economy, that we're encouraging engineering and ICT and science, Mr Speaker, that we're encouraging innovation with big investments in the innovation space, Mr Speaker, that we're encouraging more free trade deals that work for New Zealand exporters, Mr Speaker, that we're encouraging the growth of capital in New Zealand, we're encouraging the natural resources sector by working with iwi and Māori and getting the treaty settlements done so there are stronger investors in regional New Zealand, Mr Speaker. And we're encouraging all these things through our business growth agenda and through the financial decisions of this government, Mr Speaker. And that was why the New Zealanders are supporting not just the economic policies but the fiscal policies of this government, because they know what it means in terms of great jobs and great growth for New Zealand. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
I call the honourable member Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise on behalf of the Green Party to talk on this Imprest supply debate. And